So alive, we just wait for at least just a sizable number of people, then we can begin the stream. So please, the moment you see the live, wherever you're accessing it from, please share in your different platforms and reach, so that we can reach as many people as we can. All right, we have at least 7 people. I think we are good to go. So you are most welcome to this live stream. Basically, it's brought to you by the Ask ATI Initiative under the USAID Open Spaces project. Now, as always, the USAID Open Spaces Zambia project is funded by USAID and implemented by Internews in partnership with FHI 360. And of course, on this platform, under this live discussion, we continue advocating for the enactment of the Access to Information Law. And of course, today we want to look at some of the gaps that exist, and then how possibly some of these gaps that exist in line with access to information would be, sorted out should the Access to Information Law be enacted. I have a guest. A very good friend of mine, Moses Mbewe Jr. Thank you so much, sir, for coming through, and we always value your insights. You are most welcome, sir.
Thank you so much.
All right. Like I indicated, wherever you're accessing this particular live discussion, you're free to comment as well. Please let us know in terms of your observations with regards to some of the gaps that exist so far in as far as access to information in Zambia. But then context is that the cabinet, as you might be aware, some of you, that they have granted initial approval for the introduction of the Access to Information Bill in Parliament. And so this simply makes it, making a very, very significant step in terms of promoting transparency, accountability, and corruption. This is basically the basis for our conversation in terms of the general overview. But then, Moses, let's get into it. And from you, always on this platform, we always want to understand, our guests to sort of give us their view of what they think access to information is. Obviously, you may have a different view of what access to information is, and would really be grateful if you shared with us, according to you, what is access to information, even before we talk about the bill or the law itself.
Yeah, well, in layman's terms, if we're just to put it in general, it is about any information. It could be any information about anything, but to put it in context of our conversation, we are looking at information that is held by the government, information that is found in all the institutions that are run by the government, quasi, these institutions that may partly be owned by government. And we're also looking at the information that is about the country and the people that are leading the country. Just explaining it in simpler terms so that it makes more sense. But then this is not just information that is readily available, and that's why there has to be a law that compels the people that are in power to make it easy for ordinary citizens to have access to how much money is being spent on particular projects, because there could be other details that may not be disclosed, which are very crucial to holding to account the people that are in power. And it becomes very difficult if there is no law which can be used. And that's why when you look at the arms of government, the executive might be making these decisions, but is there a law that could compel you to take the government to court for not releasing this information? And so that's why there has been this urgent demand for this information, because it is because of the absence of this information that even if you try to hold them to account, it becomes very difficult to pin them using the specifics, because there is no law that's pushing them to sort of act as it may be demanded. But if there is the court, which is under the judiciary, and there is a law that is there to tell the citizen to say, if you are demanding for this amount of money to be disclosed, you already know that issues to do with corruption would have minimized. And so in the current context, it's become very difficult to hold government to account, because even as we are looking at the latest news, it already presents some challenges, because even if we say it's been signed in principle, which is a very good thing, it's a significant step that's been taken. It's never happened that to reach a stage where now cabinet is openly coming up to give us this kind of an update. But then to just explain what this means is we're looking at basically that cabinet has accepted all the proposals that people have been put out to have this information made available. But then if it is signed in principle, it means that government still has the power to not disclose what has been accepted and what hasn't been accepted, while we might look at it to be a positive report at the moment, or which the minister gave as an update.
All right, now just straight into it, and I know that you highlighted quite a number of points in your introductions. I mean, you're a journalist. You've been practicing for recommendable number of years. What are some of the gaps that you've noticed exist in terms of how lack of access to information is impacting general citizenry to the level of someone in the most remotest part of this world, and of this country rather, and also should there be a chance that we have the access to information law in place? How then do you think such challenges would be sort of resolved by this particular piece of legislation that we are discussing this evening?
Firstly, the bill itself, or the same information that we're demanding for, hasn't been given the attention itself that it deserves to make people aware about its importance. And even if we were to take even the people that we might think are quite exposed, not just academically, but just that level of exposure, you will notice that there isn't much information on the same bill itself. And so that in itself is a challenge. You need that information, but is there information about the same bill that should give you the right to have access to to information? And to a greater extent, that also could be a challenge, that even after the law it becomes law, it would be a challenge for others to just have the courage to go out to demand this information from these public institutions. And so this is another gap that exists, but also the biggest, because we're looking at around 23 years of this bill not being passed into law, not actually becoming law that would make it easy to implement. It also comes back to what we are looking at, that despite this being signed, this positive result that we're looking at, there's been an issue of, on the part of political will, have we really seen it? If until most recently, when the minister committed, because initially, for the pressure that the media has been and other CSOs have been trying to mount on the government, because this was one of the big campaigns by the UPND, but it's a big test for them. Will they be able to push this to be put into action? Because that's the biggest part that we're looking at now. At least that even if sensitization may not be 100%, I think it would be a great opportunity to be victory, not just for the media, but also the CSOs and lovers of the truth, lovers of transparency, lovers of people that hate corruption. It will be a great opportunity now to just go out and be able to inform people, because already there is a law which in itself has no big issues as far as we are concerned. We can only be concerned at this stage if at all there are other details that might be added, which might make it a weaker law, because we need to also take into account that people in parliament also want to make it easy to just disclose certain details for other reasons. And so it's just important that we take into account that implementation has been a big challenge. It's one of the gaps. And we also need to take into account that governments might also use other parts of the law to try to make an excuse to say what is being demanded for may not work because there is another law, it conflicts with another law. So what are we looking at if then this has been signed in principle? So that is also another gap. If there is uncertainty as to what it means to sign in principle, and there are other details that may arise or other things that might be removed, it also just presents another challenge. And that's why it's important that we understand what it means to sign in principle. At this stage, governments need to really explain what exactly is lacking, because if it goes unchallenged, it may as well present the challenges that we're trying to avoid while pushing for accountability, transparency in governance. So that's the challenge that I've personally noted. But also just to look at other things that would make this something good. We're looking at other organizations that government might be doing business with also being brought into picture. And so some of the reasons for introducing this is to just basically encourage the government to be more transparent. Issues of corruption keep coming up. We keep seeing reports every day of fighting corruption, past, present. And so this in itself is a bigger opportunity for Zambians to get engaged and be able to understand what this means, because it would be very challenging at some point if it just goes like it's just one of those updates that are given and we don't really take it serious. We wouldn't want to reach that stage where it just happens like there was no attention that was paid to. It is at a very, very crucial stage where anything can happen. It can go back to the same thing that we've been trying to avoid, it not going to parliament, because parliament is a very crucial stage that government needs to, cabinet should help to push. If it goes before parliament, you are aware that at least there is some possibility of, coming back to the earlier question about issues of the gaps that might be there, we're also looking at issues of the limited scope. In the current state, there could be other types of information that might have, exceptions as to what information should be published, what information should be given to the public, and that same information which might be crucial because it might either implicate the relations of the state with other states. It could be, not saying that this is exactly the same, but just giving an analysis of what might be the challenge. We're looking at other types of information. What are they that might complicate the situation? And so there could be other exceptions as to what other information needs to be included that can become accessible to the public. So that's another challenge. But also quickly is an issue of privacy with the internet already an issue where information is concerned. Obviously, this might also be one of the things that will be considered as we are looking at it being signed in principle, and it also may just present these gaps. And so it's important to also take note that there is the internet, which has come with its own challenges. Will that information be made available with social media in mind, with the internet in mind? If it was signed maybe 20 years ago, obviously by now would be talking about certain amendments. And so it is important at this stage to take into account that if then there is the picture of the internet in mind, if we're saying it's been signed in principle, does this try to address issues that we are trying to avoid, where it might at some point have these challenges? And so it's important that it goes quickly to Parliament so that it may not have other excuses as to why it may not be a reality. 23 years is quite a lot of time. I remember, I think, when this was being discussed, I wasn't even in school. And so that tells you how important this piece of law is.
Yeah, well, there's a question, but we sincerely apologize for that break of transmission. On my part, internet seems to be very weak here. But then I don't know if you addressed a question. There's a question from Geoffrey Chilango. He asks whether the new bill restricts government from unilaterally declaring some information not accessible on grounds of national security. Do you think maybe that even in the presence of the access to information law, for example, there will still be issues of saying, okay, this information cannot be accessed because of security matters? Do you think that such should be an issue of concern? Do you think there should be restrictions even having the law into presence?
Yeah, so that's partly what I was talking about when you went offline. But just to answer the question in more specific way, we are looking at also governments. Specifically, I was trying to look at this part where we're saying it's been signed in principle. So what exactly is Cabinet saying? At this point, Cabinet still may not be able to give the other details of the information that might become accessible to the public. And bearing in mind that Zambia is, part of many regional and also international organizations, there will be an issue of how does this information affect the relations with other states, other agreements. What implications would this have? Because remember, there is also other information that may not be released because government may be in agreement with other nations that would require that certain information not be disclosed. And so what does that mean? That's another challenge in itself, because it could be a great opportunity, especially if it involves the use of public funds. What does this mean to those of us that want to really understand how it will affect not only just the press, but also the general citizenry? And so that's a very critical question that we need to understand at this very stage when we are saying it's been signed in principle, because there is a probability, and most likely that might also be a challenge, that even after it's been signed, it becomes law. It might be signed to be a very weak law, which will easily backfire at some point if these issues are not tackled right now, and we still have time to try to understand. Why that question again comes in to be very important is it may be used as an excuse, not necessarily, even if there may not be other situations, it may be assumed to be a challenge in not really making it a very powerful law to try to avoid issues of corruption. And already we are looking at law enforcement agencies in this case. Where are they? Will they be compelled to give this kind of information? Because we've seen some of the cases which have been investigated, they'll just tell us to say, we may not be able to disclose. I know, like, one of the cases, I recently did an interview with the Anti-Corruption Commission, where a lot of people are still demanding to say, we want to know how that 65 million kwacha from the Faith Musonda case was gotten, who are the people that were involved. And because there are other acts that are preventing disclosure of this information, people end up not knowing. And so will it change that? Will it also necessitate the change of other acts that may not be able to give it the power to just make it more fulfilling? That's another question that needs an answer right now, because we've reached a very critical stage. But it will even be more interesting if it goes to Parliament, because that's where other issues may need to better be addressed?
Yeah, well, by and large, on this particular platform, like you rightly indicated, we've also made it very clear that look, this particular piece of legislation does not only benefit the media, but every citizen, be it at ward level and up to national level. But then
Yeah.
maybe if a follow up would be, and maybe I'm based in this area. I was monitoring one of the news, one of the media houses did air a story to do with persons with visual impairment, failing to access CDF because of there is no information that is packaged to simply suit them. Do you think that maybe once we have this particular piece of legislation, it will be very easy for all settings, or maybe how best do you think this particular piece of legislation should sort of help citizens to understand information? How best do you think it should be implemented in order that every every citizen is not left behind in terms of access to public information?
Well, I think what's important is it becomes easy if it becomes low, because that means you can just walk into these different public institutions and demand. Obviously, maybe the challenge that we might have, regardless of the circumstances that you might be in, what we might face as a challenge, obviously, is the enforcement part, because if we do not know which information needs to be given and enforcement becomes a problem. What I'm trying to just explain is, let's imagine there is a situation here where there is corruption that's been reported and you require certain information. Then you go there, because we've lived like this for a long time. If I'm told that information is classified to be information that may not be released to the public, how will I know? It's an issue of enforcement. So how will the people that need to be put to account be able to release that information? Because regardless of the circumstances, it will become a challenge if you do not have the power to demand. And how will you demand for this? And so it's an issue of understanding that we still have a bigger part to do. Remember, it's not just for the press, but the general citizenry, as you've explained. It could be our brothers and sisters, children who may not be circumstantially be in good conditions. Will this have any impact? How will they be empowered? That's an important question to ask. Enforcement, if I'm told this information cannot be made available for whatever reasons, even when there is this law, we are also trying to address the fact that people need to have the courage to demand for this information, because if you do not know the information that you're demanding, how will you be courageous enough to demand for it? And so that's obviously another part that needs to be done. But we need to also look at what progress will be made from now up to the time that it becomes law. I think that becomes easy if, as we go along, it becomes law and we're already doing the sensitization, like what's going on right now. I think step by step, we'll get somewhere. These other challenges where it just requires implementation and demand, I think those are the other issues that might be sorted along the way. So for me, it's an issue of, after it's implemented, will there be enforcement? What will be the consequences of not giving me that information? Because government, again, on the other side, is trying to defend that there might be certain, and there will be definitely information that will not just be given out because you've demanded for it for accountability purposes. And so what will be the consequences of not?
So we've just lost out Moses. We hope that he could join us back. Internet is not quite really good. Thank you for coming back, sir. You were on the floor.
Yeah. So I was just concluding the point, saying, I think we need to look at if there has to be some sort of a commission. I'm just thinking that should be able to handle these issues, an independent organization specifically tasked to deal with issues where if there is information that is not given out, it should be able to act on these issues, and it should be formed in form of an act of parliament, so that there is no perceived interference from the cabinet. Obviously, we might want it to be structured in a way that it is completely detached from any political influence, because if there is no body in place to help enforce or address any abnormalities as to what information is lacking, what information needs to be dealt with, what information is not being given out, all the complaints that are coming from the public, it must be actively on the ground dealing with all these issues. If there is no body in place, obviously what we are going to have is a situation where they'll just tell you to say, no, where are you going to take the government if it fails to give you information? Where are you going to take that officer if they don't give you that information? And so it's just important that there is some sort of a body that's there to monitor independently. And obviously it might require setting up inclusion of different stakeholders. Already the people are the main players, but I feel that's a critical stage that may help deal with that challenge of where, regardless of the circumstances, to access this information.
All right. Now, I need your very honest opinion around this particular question. How would you rate our current information seeking habit, and do you think maybe once if we have the privilege of having the access to information law, then we'll have this appetite to sort of begin to seek information? Do you think the law itself will change our information seeking habit?
Information seeking habits, and obviously we might need to look at it from the different age groups. In my personal view, for the youthful group, I think there is less demand for very important information, and this can be seen by the interactions online. Can give you an idea of what information the youths are looking for. I think the older, maybe let's say those in the above the youth group, are much more concerned about this information. For the youth group, you will notice this towards the election period. That's where there is that hunger to try to access certain information. But I think if there is more youth engagement, it's possible that the habits may change. But I'm also looking at the fact that how does this age group react? For example, if there's the Auditor General report is out, both for just the main report and for local government, the local governments, how do we consume that information? That should give us an idea. But I think it could also be a question of, is it that the information, that the manner in which the information is packaged is more technical? Will this help to deal with the challenges of the use of jargons? Maybe. So it may not. It will all depend on the efforts that will be put into be able to encourage this age group. And another interesting thing is to also look at it, not just to look at it from the national level, but at the local level. The youths really engaging in this type of conversation. If you have these conversations at that level, it should give you an idea that there is demand. So right now, if you look at CDF, for example, who are the people that have accessed the most? So that should give us an idea if young people have responded. And then I'll look at an example of this is the bursaries. There have been certain constituencies where they've not really responded positively, and that should give us an idea where money has just gone out, more money given, but then there are very few youths that have responded. And so that gives you an idea that there is work to be done. Normally, youths want to access this information when there is an election, but I kind of think that it may change. That is depending on how much will the press be able to give out, how much will the community be able to demand collectively as a whole. I think it's got potential to change, because if the conversation has already been going on around this, how much more will happen if it becomes law? And so it's a 50-50 challenge, because we also need to look at just the quality of information that's being consumed online, because Zambia, I think in the last 5 years or so, has seen a big shift in terms of just people going online and accessing this information. So it's a two-way traffic. We may be able to fully tell what happens when it becomes a law, but it's a two-way traffic.
All right. If you want to contribute, let it just not be a conversation between me and Moses. If you want to contribute, please get into the comment section. Get your comments. So tell us what you think in terms of your general overview about or around the Access Information Bill, the whole process, and how you think it should be made Zambian friendly. I wanted to say user friendly, but Zambian friendly, in order that every citizen may feel part and parcel of this particular piece of legislation. But then Geoffrey has asked, which is also one of the questions I wanted to find out, whether or not you given the we're just remaining roughly about 2 years and some months before another general election, and then obviously, given the background that we've had this talk around the Access Information Bill for years now, you and I may not have been in school by that time, but then are we seeing the current government, enacting this particular piece of legislation in the remaining few years before elections, or it's another thing that probably they may want to ride on in order that they get momentum, get sympathy from the people that they may seek re-election in the forthcoming general election?
Well, I do not doubt that at that stage where we are, this will be enacted. My main concern is on what it will be like. Are we going to see what we have been advocating for? Because it may encounter challenges, and what will happen if it goes in Parliament? Will Parliament fully support this? Will the numbers be in favor? Because that's the challenge again that we need to look at. And so, is the government really going to do it? I do see that happening, but then the challenge here is on the contents, because if it's been signed in principle and there are no details to really explain what we're going to expect. Remember what happened to Bill 10. You already have a law. It had so many questionable things around it. The same thing happened when we looked at recently when the journalists were looking at issues of regulation of the media. A law is agreed upon in its stages. Then at some point, you hear cabinet is also pushing for certain things to be removed, to be added. And so it's important at this stage to understand what are these details that need to be included, or that the government is supposed to at least give us in order for us to be able to have an idea of what it will look like, because it might become a very weak law, or a law that will have challenges because of other existing laws. I was just earlier talking about, there was a point where we raised possibilities of what if it comes in conflict with other existing agreements, which may already be empowered by existing laws. And so if this law comes in, will it affect other agreements that may likely be compromised if there is a law that compels the government to disclose certain information? And so you will notice that there are other we just talked about some of the agreements of the IMF. There's been questions around as to what information government has disclosed and hasn't disclosed. So if there is an already existing agreement between Zambia and any of these parties that we're looking at, either a bilateral agreement or multilateral agreement, would that come in conflict with some of these agreements that may likely affect the political side of the situation? And so that's what we need to also understand. But I do see it becoming a law. I'm just concerned on the contents, because there is always that challenge when you look at the implementation of laws. A law that takes you, a bill that takes over 20 years to reach at a stage where we've reached, previous governments have promised to make it a law and have gone. We're talking about the MMD and the Patriotic Front. They all committed, and now here is the UPND reaching at this stage where it's been signed in principle. It becoming a law, by assessment, I'm looking at around 80% of it, possibility of it becoming before the next election is high.
I mean, this particular law that we are longing to see is coming at a time where we have so much digital advancement, issues of fake news. How relevant do you think the media should be, even after being empowered with this particular piece of legislation? Should that be the case? How best do you think the media should still be able to, to ensure that there's sanity in terms of how information is circulated, how information is really shared, especially traditional media in this case?
Yeah, well, a traditional media or the mainstream media should, by all means, continue to take the front seat, but also increase on online presence. It becomes a challenge when online platforms, which may not be classified as mainstream, are the ones that are leading the race. What happens if a page that's posting fake news is the one that's got more numbers than the mainstream online? So the probability of fake news being spread is higher compared to if the traditional media took the leading front, they took lead of the race. So the media, I think, may not just be the only part to look at. We also just need to look at individual citizens, because you've mentioned an issue of technological advancement. Right now, we are talking about artificial intelligence, which is able to write things, unimaginable things. We are looking at journalists' jobs, in most cases, being threatened. I read one article on the BBC on if you're just a regular journalist that's always just writing from the speeches, how AI is going to, at some point, just overtake these jobs. Only for the investigative journalists, they're the ones that we're looking at, that stand a better chance of staying in the race. So amidst such, and because there is already concern about artificial intelligence generating false information, that in itself is a challenge. And so even as we are looking forward to this, we need to also be aware of the dangers of that, because the same information that might be made available to the public might still be abused. And so we need to look at how this bill works well alongside other acts like the Cybersecurity and Cyber Crimes Act. Do they harmonize? I think that's also a very crucial question to look at, because even the Cybersecurity and Crimes Act in itself has got a lot of gray areas that need to be addressed. And so it's just important that this is not just left to the traditional media to talk about, because it's not even a law for the media alone. The CSOs, everyone, even the government itself, He needs to provide this information because there might be other cases of corruption that are going on, and if the government is to definitely demonstrate that it's willing to fight corruption, then it must be able to make information that will help the people, provide better checks and balances. People in the political arena also will need this information to provide credible checks and balances. And so technological changes have got an impact on the kind of information that we're going to really access. So that's what I think.
All right. Now, even though there seems to be hope already being given by government in terms of assurance that this particular piece of legislation might come into law, how best do you think? I mean, you've highlighted well that this particular piece of legislation is not made for the media, but for each and every citizen, private or public, including government. How best do you think there should be continued advocacy in terms of enactment of this particular bill into law?
Could you just say the question again?
Well, I'm just trying to find out, are there any ways in which people should continue engaging government in order that the continued advocacy for this particular piece of legislation to be enacted into law?
One, so I think on the social media platforms, visibility had to be seen. I think right now there is a trending story about this information and anything that might try to compel the public to put pressure on the government. I think that tells us that there is the absence of that may have serious implications. It might give the government a signal to say, well, there is just a smaller group of people that are demanding for this information, and so it may not be seen as something that's urgent. But then those who are already advocating, like using these platforms, I think there is need to have these conversations, deliberately trying to demonstrate to the people that this is a very important law. I think we need to do much more in terms of just packaging it in the local languages. I think on that front, I've noticed there has been a gap in terms of just advocating for this in the local language. I've seen the Free Press Initiative has taken a very good approach, trying to push for this. Ms. John Chera, I actually commend her for the good job that she's done to try to influence the just advocacy itself has changed since they came on board. But what's important is the people need to get talking on the ground in the different wards. There has to be that big conversation going on, because if people are already talking on the ground, people in their at home, in schools are talking, then that is going to change. Because right now, like I mentioned, there is no big story that would compel or put more pressure on the government. And so therefore, there is just need to further change the approach. We already know of very influential platforms that can help to push for this visibility. People need to see that the seriousness of this same information, the demand for it to become a bill, rather for it to become a law. Yeah, so for me, that's what I think in terms of just continuing to see advocacy in action.
No, I mean, as we are slowly getting towards the conclusion of our program, let's now talk about responsibility. How best do you think Probably to some extent. Well, this is just my personal views. Somehow, maybe when I seek to sort of evaluate all the years it has taken, for respective and previous governments to sort of put this particular piece of legislation into law. Maybe the fear could be that once this is enacted, then people will sort of lose a sense of security and become irresponsible in terms of how information is shared. What if that is true? How best do you think that if this particular piece of legislation is given to the Zambians, people should be responsible even after that?
Well, just yes, we're already looking at information that we're not talking about information concerning there is already the State Security Act that protects the concerns might be around the state security. Will it be able to compromise that? We are looking at the different acts that are already in place. Will it have any consequence on that? I think if it doesn't, but all that it does is just provide accountability and transparency and help to hold the government to account. The concerns right now may not be seen in that spectrum. The real issue here that we need to address is, will the information be given out responsibly? The facts will remain the facts, regardless of how people might try to twist the facts. So issues of responsibility may not necessarily be a question at this stage. By now, we would have had a global issue, even just from one of the countries that have these laws in place, would have heard of these concerns. And so these acts will work hand in hand with other existing laws. And so the challenge here is, will the information be given out responsibly? I think that's what we need to look at, because the facts will remain the same, even if people may try to, and by the way, you cannot really control what people think or how they react to different situations. What's important is that there is a law and there are other laws in place that will balance up the situation. So there is no concern of responsibility in terms of what people are going to do with the information. This is just information that's compelling the government to give people information that belongs to them. How is the money being used? On what is the money being spent? You don't want to hear of people all of a sudden just building mansions without a record of how they use that money. And so all these questions that we're having right now will be addressed, because this is what keeps coming out. Every time there is a case under investigation, people want to know, how did somebody acquire all this wealth? So because there is no law that is pressuring these people in power, the different public institutions are in sort of this mode where they don't feel the need to do so. But if there is a law, I think it moves people in action. The very fact that people will demand for that information is responsibility. So our concern might be seen on the other side, if it will be given out responsibly, or it will be given out to try to protect or shield people that might be abusing public resources. So our concern should be on the quality of information that will be given out in an event it becomes law, as we are anticipating for it. Because there might be resistance from some government officials and agencies who keep certain information hidden, and this might lead to challenges that in terms of just accessing very critical information. And that's why it comes back to the board that we are looking at, the commission that I was talking about earlier. It may play a very critical role in pressuring these officials to give this information. And I think in the place of that, if you have that sort of arrangement in place, it will likely do away with all these challenges that we have.
All right, we would let's just check if at all there are some other comments that we haven't read from people. Please, you're free to contribute in case you have an opinion you have a question that probably myself and Moses could delve into. You are free to do that.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at some questions online where someone was asking, is disclosure of funders of political parties covered under the new bill? I think this, I do not have details of that, but then we're looking at public funds, and so most likely it's a question of whether the party in power will have access to public funds, and so that's where that question comes in. What avenues does this bill provide to citizens who want to disclose information to? I'm not sure if you're able to see these questions, Josias.
I'm trying to scroll, but my internet is misbehaving a bit. Let me just try to scroll.
Yeah, but just to maybe respond to that question, we're looking at the bill providing an avenue for citizens to just seek disclosure of information when the government refuses to disclose it. So in an event the government says it will not give you that information, this bill creates that avenue for citizens to seek disclosure, to put the government under pressure to provide this information. And so we are looking at about 4 areas, I think, because you need to also bear in mind that there is also the protection of whistleblowers, and so there is need to take that into account. Certain information needs protection of whistleblowers in an event that there might be some alleged interference, and so the bill should also be able to provide protection. Why? To encourage individuals to share information, even in the face of government resistance. In an event the government is trying to hide certain information, there has to be, if somebody comes across very critical information that might be helpful in an investigation. And so in other cases, we're also looking at the bill being able to just basically help create what we might call a judicial review, where citizens demand for a review of the government's decision to withhold information, and this may be done through the courts that we talked about earlier. So it should give citizens that sort of power to go even as far as to the court in an event that the government fails to provide information for whatever reasons. That's a very crucial part. That the question that came from on Facebook, I was just looking, that was Geoffrey Chilango. Your question, I think the most crucial part that we're looking at here is, will the courts be able to help? That's a very important part, and that's why we're saying there is need to also try to establish an independent commission that would try to help to advocate for this in an event of rights being violated, when citizens demand for accountability. So there has to be even a judicial review. The courts must be empowered enough to hear why certain information hasn't been given out, if it is very crucial to the public understanding the investigations or the decisions of the government.
All right. Not knowing if you had anything to conclude on as we officially close, but then there's always a general question that we usually ask you. This particular question is without the show, and the question is, how soon do you think Zambia needs this particular piece of legislation, which is the access to information law, and why?
By now, we should have been talking what needs to be improved. It should have been history. We would have obviously been talking about refinements. So that tells you that this should have been done right when it was introduced. 20 years ago should have been enough for this kind of conversation to be history. And so why we've seen cases of corruption end like nothing happened. and you don't get to fully understand, you're just left with questions. And so to satisfy these questions, we need to have a law that will push citizens to even take the government to court if they're not satisfied with the quality of information that's given out. And so it's just important that this, if there was a way out, by now we should have been celebrating to say, oh, at least there is something that will push you when you walk into an office. You'll not be asked why you want that information, because there is already a law that empowers you as a citizen, as a journalist, as a Zambian. So that should have happened a long time ago, should have happened yesterday, should have happened in the past.
Could I take that as your concluding remarks? So you had something that probably you wanted to add with regard to the conversation?
Well, the one issue that I would like just to look at is what happens in an event that something the government tries to resist. What happens? I think that's why there is just urgent need for it to go to Parliament, and then it should also give citizens an opportunity to look at what the priorities of their parliamentarians are, and if at all they are very much interested in not just themselves, because even after they're out of office, they will become citizens like all of us. And so that's a very crucial stage that needs to quickly be undertaken, so that all these discrepancies that we've been seeing don't become a debate. Lots of monies are being sent into constituencies, and citizens only get to hear to say a project worth this much has been constructed, but without a knowledge of how it came about. And so it's just important that, especially at the grassroots level, there is a law in place that will allow people to walk into the local authorities' offices to demand for this information to be made available to them, why certain contracts have been awarded to certain people, why certain people haven't been awarded certain contracts. You need to have all this information, because at times when you go, even at any council, they will tell you, well, this was found to be the suitable contractor. But were there that same contractor who had issues in the past where they constructed a project poorly, and they still get a chance to get more funding? So citizens must be the ones in the forefront. Just don't want to see people that politically aligned to be the ones taking the opportunity to find out why certain things are working that way. I think it's just important that this is done quickly, so that we are able to just improve in the way that we demand for accountability in the use of public funds.
All right, thank you so much, sir, for making an appearance. Like I said in my introductions, that we value your insights, and we hope that you could be available each time when we call on you.
Thank you.
All right, I guess this is where we have to conclude this episode. Remember that it is brought to you by the Ask ATI Initiative under the USAID Open Spaces Zambia project. The USAID Open Spaces Zambia project is funded by USAID and implemented by Internews in partnership with FHI 360. Now, in the description, we added a link, which is a petition to compel government to enact the Access Information Bill into law. So please get into our description on top and check the link, or you can go to the Alliance for Community Action ACA Facebook page, check out the link, and sign voluntarily. You can be able to also be part and parcel of the people that are joining to continue advocating for the enactment of the access to information. Tomorrow is our last episode, and we shall come again live at this particular same time. Thank you so much to those of you that have been following remotely, and in particular, allow us to sincerely thank Mr. Geoffrey Chilango, who has religiously been following our episodes from day one, and also Kim Malama and Oment Kawombeka. I hope I pronounced your surname very correctly, sir. Richard Mulwanda as well. We appreciate your comments, plus those of you that were also following from various platforms that you were using to follow. Thank you so much, and bye for now.